I would like to welcome everybody at this Not for Sale event. I'm Luc Zelderlo, Secretary General of EASPD, and EASPD is a European network of support services for persons with disabilities. We represent around 17,000 organizations active across the European continent. Welcome at this Not for Sale event. Of course, the conditions are not ideal. Talking to one another face to face would be much nicer, much better. But that is how it is. We will try to make the best out of it. Of course, in Corona times, we are all tempted to talk about the virus and the effect of the virus on ourselves, our families, and our working environment. We will try to avoid doing that, but still, I hope on behalf of the EASPD board and the team in Brussels and myself, of course, I hope that everybody is fine, that your families are fine, and that indeed, if you are a service provider, I hope that you can continue providing essential services to people with support needs. If you want to know more about what we do on fighting the virus, you can join our Facebook page or our Wednesday afternoon webinars, during which we try to tackle Corona-specific issues. Today's debate is not about Corona, it is about what type of funding facilitates the implementation of the ambition of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with a Disability. Is a funding system relevant? Does it have an impact on how services are developed and designed? And maybe above all, does this have an impact on how the person that is supported experiences his or her quality of life, integration in inclusion in society? What type of impact does the funding model have? Is public procurement the best possible system? Do we want to go for reserved markets, putting the social services sector a bit outside of the harsh competition on the open market? Should we go for personalized budgets? These are different models that we should discuss now. The starting point should be what promotes quality and what drives quality down. And why this debate at European Union level? Well, the European Union and especially the public procurement legislation has a scene-setting impact also for social services, also for social service provision. The EU rules make, to a certain extent, our sector also a field for competition. And it is not always quality that is the driver for this competition. So that is why we should discuss it here. And I would like to share with you a statement of a person that I admire as an individual and as a professional. One of the vice presidents of the European Disability Forum, Rodolfo Catani, stated, "Social services are a means to facilitate the active participation of all in the community. They are only useful if they serve this goal." And then the question is the funding system allowing service providers to be flexible, to adapt, and to provide tailor-made, individualized services? Indeed, dear colleagues, dear friends, public procurement is legislated at European Union level. And in many situations, it promotes privatization with a sort of a focus on costs elements only. Sometimes, indeed, it seems as if it puts the rights of persons with disabilities for sale to the cheapest bidder. Is this right? Should social services be for sale? That is what we have to discuss this morning. And we know indeed that the public procurement legislation allows to use other instruments, other techniques to fund services, but quite often these instruments are not known by national, local, or regional authorities, so they don't use it. Indeed, we have the reserved markets, and it will be discussed later on this morning. Indeed, we have personalized budgets that bring a complete shift in power balance and promote innovation very, very strongly. These are different systems. There might be more. Let's discuss and let's see where the debate brings us. Our objective for today is to better understand the different systems and their positive and maybe also negative effects they bring with them. We will also share with you a study that was done over the last few months, and we hope that the entire debate will help us to better understand the complexity of the systems across Europe. We also want to make sure that what we discuss here today will find its way into other important debates that we are having now at European Union level, and that is the development of a new European disability strategy, the implementation on the European pillar of social rights, European semester, and other crucial debates for the further development of a so needed social services sector. Dear colleagues, social services, should they be for sale? Yes or no? That is what we will debate this morning. And it is with pleasure that I hand over to my colleague, Thomas Bignell, Policy Officer at EASPD, who is working on this topic now since several years. And I consider him as being one of the top experts on this topic in the Brussels bubble. Thomas, with pleasure, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luc, for that, I think, very thorough, maybe even slightly provocative or challenging opening for many in this room. I won't have anything to add besides we will try and make this call as webinar as interactive as possible. If you have a question, then please write it down in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen if you move your mouse a bit. Alternatively, although not preferably, you could also include it in your chat, but of course it's much harder for me to be able to cover the Q&A and the chat at the same time. Also, we have, of course, let's say, some dedicated speakers in each of the panel. But if you have, as an attendee, as a participant, a statement or an input that you think is really relevant to make, a short statement, then please also highlight it in the Q&A, and if we have the time, of course, we may be able to give you speaking rights so you could bring in your perspective as well. That is an option, and we will try and make that feasible. But I think, from our perspective, what we wanted to do is to start with, let's say, what's really happening on the ground. And that can't come from me or Luc, who are stuck in the Brussels bubble. But it should start from someone who has experienced public procurement on the ground in Finland. So we will be hearing from Pia Matihaldi about her experience with public procurement in Finland. Pia, the floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes. I will unmute you.
Hello, everybody all over the world. And I'm sorry that I am going to have my speak with Finnish and Kirsi is going to translate because there is so many words what I can't say by English. So, Kirsi, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello. Elämme hyvin haastavassa pandemian aiheuttamassa tilanteessa.
We are living in a very difficult situation at the moment, of course, partly caused by the pandemic.
Tämä on tuonut meidän arkeen uusia rajoitteita omaisten vierailussa palveluyksikössä ja kotilomiin.
This has caused us new restrictions. Of course, how often we can't visit our child in her home, and she can't visit us at our home.
Ja tämän kaiken kaaoksen keskellä odotamme uutta kilpailutuskierrosta Kangasrouskun palveluyksikössä.
And in the middle of all this chaos, we are waiting for a new procurement in a service our girl is living in, which is called Kangasrousku.
Haluan tuoda Euroopan unionille tietoon, miten elämänmittaisten välttämättömien palveluiden kilpailutus heijastuu palvelun käyttäjään ja koko perheeseen.
In my speech, I want to become to your attention the affections the public procurement has had on our family and our child in recent years.
Tytärtämme eikä meitä vanhempia kuunnella palveluiden järjestelyissä, sillä emme ole asianosaisia.
Our girl or we as parents are not heard when decisions about the service have been made because we are not by law seen as part of the decision-making process.
Koska meitä ei katsota asianosaisiksi kansallisen hankintalain perusteella, niin meidät on syrjäytetty välttämättömien palveluiden suunnittelussa.
Because we have not been seen as people who should be considered to ask and discuss when decisions about the service have been made. We have been totally left out when the designing of the services and arrangements have been made and are made all the time.
Tyttäremme asuu Oulussa kehitysvammaisille tarkoitetussa palveluyksikössä, joka on valmistunut 2010.
Our girl is living in a service in a group home in Oulu since 2010.
Asukkaat pääsivät muuttamaan taloon elokuussa, joten he ovat asuneet kodissa 10 vuotta.
She moved in to her home in August 2010, so 10 years ago.
Näiden vuosien aikana on yksikön palveluntuottaja vaihtunut 3 kertaa.
During these 10 years, the service provider of this group home has changed 3 times.
Viimeisen palvelutuottajan kanssa solmittiin 3+1+1 vuoden palvelusopimus.
With the latest provider, the agreement is 3 years plus 2 optional years.
3 vuoden sopimus umpeutui vuoden 2018 lopussa ja palvelun tuottaja sai 2 vuoden optiot, joten sama palveluntuottaja toimii tämän vuoden loppuun.
The agreement was closed in the end of 2018, and the service provider decided to is using the 2 years option. So this provider will function in this service until the end of this year.
Nyt nämä optiovuodet on käytetty ja uusi kilpailutus on vireillä, ellei Oulun kaupunki päätä itse ottaa palveluyksikköä hoitaakseen.
So now the contract is coming to an end, and the new public procurement process is on the way. If the other solution is that the city of Oulu is starting to provide the service on its own.
Tästä piti olla omaisten, asukkaiden ja kaupungin päättäjien yhteinen palaveri maaliskuussa, mutta koronavirus esti tämän tapaamisen.
This was meant to be discussed in March together with the service provider, the family members and the local authorities, but this was cancelled due to the circumstances we are in.
Nyt kaupungin päättäjillä on poikkeusolojen aiheuttamia muita kriittisiä tehtäviä ja tapaaminen on siirretty tulevaisuuteen.
And in this situation, the meeting has been postponed to the coming future. Nobody knows when.
Kilpailutus aiheuttaa jälleen uusia kysymyksiä elämänmittaisten palveluiden järjestämisessä.
Again, the public procurement is causing new questions and uncertainties for the families and people living in the service.
Jos kaupunki ottaa yksikön hoitaakseen, kuinka he järjestävät päivä- ja työtoiminnan?
When the changes are coming next year, nobody knows, for example, how the daytime activities, daytime services are going to be organized, employment or others.
Kuinka moni nykyisestä henkilökunnasta siirtyy nykyisen toimijan muihin yksiköihin?
How many staff members will continue in the service and how many will be going to somewhere else?
Kuinka turvataan henkilökohtaisten avustajien kanssa käydyt harrastus- ja ostosmatkat? Kysymyksiä on valtavasti.
How will the personal assistance services to be continued? There is a lot of questions in the minds of the families and people themselves.
Jokaisen kilpailutuksen aikana asukkaat ja omaiset jännittävät, vaihtuuko palveluntuottaja ja sen mukana tutut toimintatavat ja osa henkilökunnasta.
During all the processes, there is a lot of excitement and anxious among the people who live there and families. How many of the staff will continue, and how many will go, and how much of the familiar customs will be continued, and how much will be changed again.
Tämä aiheuttaa turhaa ahdistusta ja pelkotiloja omaisissa ja asukkaissa, joista kaikki eivät kommunikoi puhumalla, viittomalla tai muulla ymmärrettävällä tavalla.
This is causing huge amount of distress and anxiety among families and people who live in the service. And it's important to know that most of the people don't communicate by speech or even with other well-known communication methods. So it's very difficult to explain the changes for them.
Jollei tule ymmärretyksi, lisääntyy ahdistuneisuus ja pelko, jotka purkaantuvat usein itkukohtauksina ja pahantuulisuutena.
If you are not understood, the fear and anxiety are increasing, which is coming out with the crying and other kind of behavior, which is not seen, and unwilling and different kind of difficult behavioral issues come out when you are not understood.
Kuinka uusi henkilökunta ymmärtää asukkaan tarpeet, kun yhteistä kieltä ei ole?
How is the new staff, which is changing, will understand the needs of people who live there when there is no language or communication methods?
Ymmärtävätkö he asukkaan eleistä ja ilmeistä, mistä on kyse tai mitä asukas haluaa tai tarvitsee?
Will they understand from the gestures of the people who live there what is the people needing and what are they meaning and what do they need?
Tunnistaako henkilökunta esimerkiksi alkavan epilepsiakohtauksen pienestä toimintahäiriöstä asukkaan kohdalla?
Is the staff, for example, recognizing the starting epileptic situation with a small gesture which is in the face of a person living there?
Miten tulisi toimia kyseisessä tilanteessa, ettei kohtaus etene niin pitkälle, että tarvitaan erityissairaanhoitoa?
How should they function in this kind of situation so that the situation will be cancelled and treated in a due time so that the special hospital is not needed?
Näitä kysymyksiä, jotka askarruttavat perheitä ja asukkaan lähipiiriä ja lisäävät kunnan terveydenhoidon kustannuksia.
There is huge amount of questions which are in the minds of families and people who live there and all the people close to them and many of the issues, for example, related to the changes in staff also have impacts of other services of the municipality.
Kehitysvammaisella itsellään ja hänen omaisillaan pitää olla mahdollisuus osallistua palveluntuottajan valintaan, jotka koskevat elämänmittaisten välttämättömien palveluiden tuottamista.
The strong point is that there should be a possibility for person him or herself and the family to be part of the decision-making process when the provider of the service is set and in the whole service designing process.
Asiakkaat itse ja hänen omaiset tietävät kunkin avun tarpeen tai tarpeet parhaiten.
People themselves and their families know best what are the support needs of them at different periods of time.
Thank you, Kirsi, and thank you for your time. No, I don't hear you. Nobody.
Thomas is muted.
Okay.
Thomas has muted
himself. Yeah.
I wanted to be fair. I'm not just muting others, also myself. So thank you, Pia, for that intervention, which covers very well the reality of thousands of people and their families in Europe today. Quite interesting because many people in Europe see Finland often as, the place where we look towards in terms of how care and support is provided. But to see that there are also challenges there, I think it helps to put us all in the same boat towards how these instruments are being used. My main points here are that I took are first and foremost the fact that your daughter and also yourselves are not included in the decision over the organization of the services and the selection of the providers in the service provision is somewhat strange, especially if we take into account the main principle of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which is nothing about us without us. So it's quite interesting that people who are taking decisions over which provider is selected are not the people who are actually benefiting from that service. And I think there's something that's definitely wrong there. Now, you did mention that once the provider is set, then there are ongoing discussions between the family and the person with disability, the family, and the provider, which is positive, but maybe that doesn't go far enough in terms of even the selection of the provider. Another key point that came for me is the uncertainty that public procurement brings. Changing provider every few years brings a lot of challenges for the people themselves, but also for the workers who always have to adapt to new circumstances. Not knowing what types of services will be available, who the workers will be, the workers who spent every day with for the last few years, knowing that they may disappear and new people come in. And that, of course, the familiar customs that you grow with and the expertise and the relationship that is built, that being put at risk is, of course, something which is very difficult for people with disabilities and also the families, and something which we should try and avoid as much as possible. But my main point is that actually public procurement, how I would like to see it, but maybe discuss in this next panel, is it doesn't really bring many solutions to the issues and the challenges that Pia brought up. But maybe I'm wrong, and that's what we will discuss now in this panel. Actually, we first have the report, but thank you, Pia, for that overview. Now we have thank you. And now we have the presentation from Rebecca Luca, who have, on behalf of EASPD, drafted an excellent report, and she will be presenting this report right now. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Let me just, okay. I hope you all hear me well, and I hope that you can all see the slides. Good morning, everybody. As Thomas just said, we prepare, let me just, okay, perfect. So we carried out this research, which was commissioned by EASPD to Cavelote's research team. The objective of the study was to describe and analyze the funding models of social service provision that are present across Europe. And we chose 4 funding models: public procurement, reserve markets, personal budgets, and private investment. So we carried out this work with my colleagues Maite and Mireia, during last year. And we carried out desk research and field research. The field research meant interviews to 17 experts from different European countries, and these countries represented different European social care environments and contexts. I'm going to go very quickly through the main findings because we don't have much time, but of course I'm available to discuss with you any issue that comes out of the report. And as I said here, we just concentrate on the main findings. So we start with public procurement. What is it? What we found? We found that public procurement is positively seen in some cases, and this happened especially in countries like Central and Eastern European countries which have limited resources and limited budget destinated to social services, and also in cases where the public authorities are not always fully transparent in the way they fund the provision of social care. So in these cases, public procurement guarantees transparency, and what is important in these cases, it covers the entire cost of social services. We also know that public procurement is set to guarantee the principles of competition, publicity, transparency, and non-discrimination. Just a couple of points regarding competition. What it might happen in some small regions or small municipalities is that the market is very small. So really there is no room for more than one service provider. But differently, in other regions, there might be bigger markets. So competition can be amongst the procurers, but the problem is that the international service providers and for-profit service providers are pushing out of the market non-for-profit organizations. So this has risen some concerns regarding the role of for-profit organization and what we can call the progressive marketization of the social service. And one example of this is in the case of Finland. Also, we have that competition among organizations has had a negative impact on the working conditions of the staff, of the care professionals. So what are the major concerns regarding the use of public procurement? Price versus quality is the most important one. The concerns arise by the way public procurement is commissioned and evaluated. Why? Because it's based on the cheapest price rather than on the quality of the service. So the problem is that if we focus on price, this will jeopardize the quality of the service provided. Also, public procurement is considered as an expensive procedure. So there are many working hours, but not only for the service providers, also for the public authorities to prepare the bid document. It's a time-consuming procedure. And of course, it's a burden for service providers that it can also have an impact on the small companies that usually do not have the staff or the resources to prepare the required documentation to apply for the bid. Also, continuous changes of the staff. The staff changes, and this is the result of continuous tendering, have negative effects. And especially for people with severe disabilities, this is a problem because usually there is a very close trust-based relationship between the person with disabilities and the caregiver. And this relationship, it takes time to be built, and it's a very close relationship. So also what Pia was saying before, like you need to know the person, and there is this very close relationship that takes time to know the person you are taking care of. One more thing that came out in our study was like public procurement focused on specifying the service instead of the outcomes, the results. So if we specify the service we want to the detail, to the minimum detail, this leaves no room for innovative ideas, and it also impedes innovation. So what we have? The result is we have standardized service as opposed to personalized service, which is what we would need in these cases. And there is also little evidence of public procurement respecting the right of choice for people with disabilities. And this, we can say that then it's not implemented according to United Nations Convention on the Rights for People with Disabilities, because people cannot choose. So what can be said? That the public procurement could work if some conditions were fulfilled, like if the focus was on quality, if social criteria, especially user needs, were reinforced, and if budget available were increased. So what we have is that although in theory, the EU directive on public procurement leaves a considerable room for freedom to public authorities to choose how to contract social services, this does not happen in reality. It has not been translated into practice. So what we found, the common scenario that we found across Europe, is we have that most public authorities, they continue to use the traditional procedures, which are based on prioritizing price rather than quality, on detailing the specifications instead of detail the outcomes. And also, even though some options could be available to take into account user needs, and one of the options will be, for instance, by involving users in the evaluation of offers, this will make it more in line with the United Nations Convention on the Rights for People with Disabilities. These options that are available are not used. Why is this? What is the reason? The reason is like it's complex. The staff is not skilled to do that, and there is also risk aversion on the part of public procurers. And last but not least, there is also scarce political support, and all these make it difficult for contracting authorities to try new ways of doing things. So dealing with complexity and giving staff the necessary skills and instruments is something which is a long-term policy objectives, and this requires a change in strategy at national level. So in the meanwhile, it is therefore important for public authorities to consider alternative funding models which may be better suited to achieving their objectives and implementing their social policy objectives. I wanted to go through this slide, but I will skip it. And if you want, we can come back at the end. It was about alliancing, which is a novel way of public procurement. It's still public procurement, but it's a more collaborative option. But as I said, since we have the time at the end, then we can come back, and I will keep on with reserve markets. So the main findings regarding reserve markets are, this is the classical, the traditional model for service provision across Europe. And it allows for a stable and long-term cooperation between the public authority and the service provider, who is usually a not-for-profit. And this gives planning and financial stability to the service provider. Usually, the service provider and the public authority, they engage in a collaborative partnership-based relationship. And this is important because it allows for more tailor-made and flexible services to meet local users' needs. So also, it allows for continuity with the service users, and this is important for services with people with mental disabilities. Continuity is something very important. You need to know who is going to take care of you. Also, because you need to build a relationship that also Pia was mentioning before. It is considered that reserve markets has a simpler application procedure when compared to public procurement, and also a certain level of quality is guaranteed. Of course, there are also some drawbacks, and one could be that there is a limited choice and control for users when this model is compared to personal budgets or to the personal assistance. In the report, in the study, you will see that there are some examples from from Austria, from the Salzburg region, and also from Spain. And there is also another example from Netherlands, from the region of Twente, in a specific type of research contract, which is called open house model. Then we moved on. Finally, we get to the personal budgets, and the main findings is like a choice, control, and responsibility in this model are transferred to the budget holder, who decides how she wants to organize his own care. So this empowers people with disability to have more freedom, more citizens, and access to their human rights. And this is very positive because it's in line with the United Nations Convention. So personal budgets also enable members of traditional, of informal networks to provide support. And it has been evaluated, and the results from the evaluations that have been carried out, they reveal constant positive outcomes, which are satisfaction, well-being, and increase in the quality of life. Personal budgets can also increase competition between providers. So it generates a kind of a market between service providers, and thus this will increase efficiency. So we have seen that they have many positive features. However, it should also be noted that even though the availability of choice is a very positive thing, for some individuals, the exercise of choice can lead to apprehension and worry. So the idea is that although choice will suggest a greater availability of services, this does not necessarily mean an increase in the quality. So even though the users have a stronger voice because they can decide what they want, the quality is not a matter of choice, but it's dependent on the qualities of the caregiver. And this is important to be kept in mind. Also, personal budgets might not be suited in all cases. What the research has found out is that it has worked well in the field of social services for people with physical disabilities, and for people with intellectual disabilities, it might be a bit more challenging. Also, managing a personal budget requires certain skills, certain competencies.
1 more minute, Rebecca.
Okay, people with disabilities, they need to know exactly what they want, and they also will have to negotiate with professionals. So what is going to happen is that they are going to become an employer, and for sure they will need support to carry out these tasks. Personal budgets, it is not a cheap option. It is needed to have enough financial resources to set up a personal budget system. And in some countries, in the UK, the implementation has been affected by bureaucracy, and there were many hidden transaction costs at the startup that they were not taking into account. Two things: the implementation of a personal budget needs a mental cultural change, but not only on the part of the users, also the service providers need to adapt, because it is not so clear that all the organizations will succeed in presenting themselves to the new market as a dynamic and attractive and professional organization. So this is important to keep in mind. And there is also fear that in some cases, the conditions, the working conditions for social workers, they can be worsened. So in the UK, low wages, antisocial hours, and difficult working conditions have been reported. This is all what I wanted to say. We have different examples in the study of countries that have implemented the personal budget system. Thank you for your attention. And of course, the study is available for everybody. And I'm also available if you want to ask any questions. Thank you. Sorry, I hope not to have gone too long.
That's fine. Thank you, Rebecca, very much. You know, covering or summarizing a 120-page report in 15 minutes is very tough, but I think you covered all the issues really well. And I think that's a very good sort of starting point, together with Pia's intervention on how to start the discussion that we will have now. So we'll quickly move on to the session on public procurement. We have 3 speakers representing different perspectives: European authorities, national authorities, and service provider and a user organization. I will start maybe with Marnix Dijkman. Maybe you could also first introduce yourself briefly. But my initial question is, in many different markets, competition, or it is assumed that competition leads to driving up better quality or better price quality value. And that's often done through good use of public procurement practices. Why do you think that public procurement can ensure best value for money in social care?
Well, good morning, Thomas. Good morning to everyone. And let me first start by saying thank you to the EASPD for organizing this this webinar, because this is a very important topic for the Dutch government. And we've had some experience in the Netherlands with public procurement of social services. And we think that a competitive procedure is not the best way to get value for money, at least in most cases. And why is this the case? Well, three important factors, I think. One, social health services or social services are firstly given, and the providers are driven not so much by a competitive considerations, but by considerations of the wish to provide the best possible care. So it's not a market as such. Two, I think these services are strongly personal in nature. So that means that the relationship between the client, if you will, and the care providers are extremely important. This has been given a good example by Mrs. Mathialdi this morning by her testimony. So I think that just says enough. Another factor is that these services are usually provided in a local area, so not on a national level, let alone an international level. That means that competition is usually quite low. And a third topic that brings about that the competition is not the best way to get value for money is that these services are usually provided in cooperation with a lot of different parties. So it's not just one service provider who provides all the care. No, they have to cooperate with different service providers, with municipality, with other organizations, with schools, etc., etc. So if you take all these different points into consideration, well, the conclusion is clear, and it's been reported in the report as well.
Thank you very much, Marnix. Quite a clear response. The Dutch authorities, in my understanding, do not believe that public procurement brings good value for money. Anna, I will move to you in the Commission. In your view, why is public procurement a useful instrument in the funding of social services? And in particular, how and why could public procurement be good for service users?
Thanks for having me and for organizing this webinar. I think this is a very good opportunity in general to speak about this topic, which we still have to wrap our heads around, I think. So let me start by saying something that might sound quite obvious to many of the panelists and maybe also the participants, but we have a pretty neutral position on public procurement in the sense that we view it as a tool that is available to public authorities. So public authorities may want to choose it or not, depending on whether they think it will work well to serve their public policy purposes. And let me say another thing that is quite obvious, but the current framework that we have at European level is fairly flexible. Of course, public procurement requires more formalities than other tools, but what we have right now allows public buyers to move with a certain flexibility. But of course, this flexibility can only be used if you focus on quality, and in particular, quality in this case means serving the needs of the users. How you can do that? Well, that entails different considerations. I will probably just focus on 3 main points here to keep it short. But first of all, in terms of procedure, because when you talk about public procurement, the big scary thing for public buyers and all actors involved is how to conduct the procedure. There's quite a bit of flexibility for social services. There are no specific procedures that are set by European rules. And actually, European rules encourage public authorities to focus on quality elements, which are basically quality elements in the interest of users, like continuity of the service, accessibility, affordability. And they also mention explicitly user involvement and empowerment. Of course, translating these into reality is always a challenge. And that's also because these quality considerations go well beyond establishing a procedure that suits, let's say, that can serve these needs, in the sense that, in a way, this complexity is inherent to social services. But looking more specifically at public procurement, there are phases of the procurement procedure that are very scarcely regulated by European law, and that are crucial to ensure the delivery of quality. And I'm talking about the preparation, the design of the service, and the preparation of the procurement procedure, and also how the contract is implemented. And these phases are, of course, crucial for the involvement of users, and they are the phases in which users can be more often involved. But of course, as I think Rebecca was also mentioning, it's possible to involve users in the assessment phase of the bids. So it's not impossible to do that. And finally, let me also mention a third point. Let's not forget that serving the needs of the users means also taking into account considerations that at first sight may not have to do directly with the welfare of the users, but have a great impact on the welfare of the users. And I'm talking about mainly considerations that relate to the employment of the staff. Public procurement doesn't have to be a way to drive down working conditions. And of course, having a staff that is not precarized is in a way serves better the needs of the users. And the other challenges, but that they're also, like, in a way, taken into account in the current framework, and you can take them into account in the context of a public procurement procedure, are of course also having a more collaborative approach, which we learned as Commission from having a dialogue with public authorities in the member states and from you, is important in this field. And there are ways to make sure that there is more of a cooperative approach during a public procurement procedure and during the implementation of the contract. But there also needs to be attention to smaller providers. So there needs to be a way for public buyers to also give the opportunity to smaller providers and to non-profit providers to compete with bigger providers or with for-profit providers in general, on getting these contracts. And there are ways to do that concretely. But the big challenge at the moment is that all of these different considerations are most often not taken into account by public buyers. So there's quite a bit of work to do in terms of raising awareness and changing the mindset in a way.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that. I will come back with a few targeted questions later on that that I've received personally. Javier, so that, sorry, Anna works for the Commission, for those who have not, don't have the agenda in front of them. Now we will move to Javier Güemes, who works for ONCE in Spain, which is both an organization of people with disabilities, but also a major employer of people with disabilities, and also provides many services. Javier, what is your view? What are your views as a whole in the ONCE organization on public procurement? Is it positive for you, or is it negative?
Okay, thank you, Thomas, and thank you to EASPD for allowing me to do this this discussion, to participate. Although it was really from the very beginning, it was more or less forbidden to speak about coronavirus. But let me just make a 5 seconds issue. Really, when we saw the crisis that we are suffering in the social services these days in Spain, we could also ask questions to ourselves: is maybe this is also a lesson learned, and I will discuss probably later on this, that sometimes the quality needs also not to focus just on prices, but focus also on the service. And the main challenges that we are facing these days here in Spain has shown that really social services and the way they were procured, in some cases, really were not really adapted to a situation like this one, and like you know, to the main challenge that we are really suffering these days. But let me just focus on 3 issues and how we see public procurement. Definitely, the way in which social clauses are advancing in the public procurement regulations, and how they were, let's say, adopted in the directives, and how they were transposed in Spain in 2017, has really been positive in a way. They made a flexible approach to inclusion of social clauses. And definitely from our perspective, for example, from ONCE perspective, in the area of employment of persons with disabilities, have been in a way supportive. You know, in Spain, for example, companies that want to, private companies that want to participate in public procurement procedures, they have the obligation to fulfill the quota system of 2% or alternative measures. So this has really supported our activity as ONCE to promote employment of persons with disabilities also in the private sector. So this is something which can be really a good impact of the new regulations, well, new regulations for Spain. The transposition took us a little bit a while. But also we have seen also big issues in the way that this flexibility can be also interpreted by civil servants. So sometimes in many ways, we need to make sure that there is a correct interpretation. And when we are speaking about different public authorities, we are speaking about states, but we are speaking also about regions, and we are also speaking about local communities. And sometimes the diversity in the interpretation of the procurement rules is too wide. So this is something that for us also is important, and it has really forced us to make a lot of initiatives to try to make sure that it is in the interpretation at those levels is correct, and sometimes it's not. It takes a lot of time. Another issue which is also positive for us is the reserve contracts, and mainly for not-for-profit. As Anna was mentioning now, and I think is very correct, the size of the social services providers in Spain, and when you're speaking of local communities, is not very big. They are a small size. And definitely they need to be protected in this way to avoid situations like in Finland, that was mentioned before by Rebecca. Really, the protection of the market for small social services providers is very important. So definitely in Spain, we are happy in the way the directive has been transposed and really has created the capacity to reserve contract mainly for small providers. I mean, as ONCE, we are a big provider, but definitely there are many others at local level which are really requiring this protection. Otherwise, for-profit organizations or companies and international could really create big problems for those small providers. Let me also mention that social clauses, and I will probably later on speak a little more about that, social clauses still are not really fully implemented in Spain. We need to really go further, we need to work further. They are used just when, in the case of equal price or similar price, then social clauses, then they are applied. But they are not applied from the very beginning. And then if there is a difference in price, the social clauses really are taken into account. So this is also for us one of the main challenges that we have to face in Spain. So let me just finalize. Later on, probably in the second question, I will have more opportunities to go into the details of our assessment of the situation. But really, definitely, private procurement and the implementation depends on the size of the market that you are really procuring. You know, really, it really creates, I mean, it will need to be adapted to the local level, to the regional level, to the state level. Sometimes big contracts really are not allowed to social services and social providers, not for profit, to compete. But I will come later on that. Basically, as a final summary of my intervention on this, it has in a way moved in a positive direction, but still the wide interpretation of it, and in some authorities, really is allowing a very difficult implementation in Spain.
Thank you, Javier, for a very clear overview. I'm pleased that you're, let's say, contradicting my black and white criticism of public procurement, because I think that's very important in this case. You mentioned, Javier, how, let's say, the quality criteria, the social clauses are seen as secondary to cost in many cases. And I wanted to go back to Mahanik's representing public authorities. Why is the integration of quality criteria in public procurement procedures, why is it so difficult?
Well, why is it so difficult? What is good quality care? That's a question that's very difficult to answer, and the answer depends on who you ask the question, I think. So why is it difficult to use public procurement for care services? Well, again, there are three different issues at hand here. I think it's difficult for public authorities to put on paper, if you will, in objective criteria what they actually want for their clients, because a public authority can't 100% say what their clients want. This was also highlighted by Rebecca, that you also want service providers to provide innovative and good quality. You don't want to prescribe everything, and even if you can prescribe those things. So it's difficult to put in writing in an objective and non-discriminatory way quality criteria. That's one. The second difficult issue is for service providers themselves, because like here in the Netherlands, municipalities are responsible for procuring these services, and service providers are confronted with more than 300 municipalities who ask them in general the same services, but all the details differ from municipality to municipality. So it's quite difficult for service providers to organize their way of operating and to provide those services for all those different municipalities. And the third point, which has been talked about this morning already quite a lot, I think, is the difficulties that recipients of these services experience, and their families. What is good quality care for one recipient is something else for another recipient. And there's a big difference between recipients with physical disabilities and recipients with more intellectual disabilities. So my answer in short would be, this is not a black and white product, if you will. That's the most basic way I can say it. It's not a black and white or easy a service to provide. So that makes it quite difficult to procure if you have these formalities which we've been talking about in a public procurement procedure.
Thank you, Mahanik. I think very clearly explaining how actually the definition of quality elements in social care is difficult for all, let's say, stakeholders, or most stakeholders in this field, both the public authorities, for the service providers, and also for the people, the beneficiaries of the services themselves. Javier, I would like to move to you. You talked about some good examples in Spain. In particular, they seem to be reserving some contracts. I mean, is for non-profit organizations? How does that work? Can we learn from how it's being used in Spain at all? How have you managed to use public procurement to promote quality?
Thank you very much, Thomas. Yes, in fact, you know, in Spain we are quite happy to have this measure of reserve contracts for not-for-profit social service providers. I think this is really, as I mentioned before, a way to make sure that social services which really do not have for-profit goals can really participate in the market. They are also fulfilling a social goal, and definitely sometimes it's more difficult for them to compete just on prices or just in some other elements which are really important sometimes in the public procurement regulation. So for us, that really way, and we can also send to all of us how it is formulated in the Spanish transposition of the directive, because really it makes a lot of sense to make sure that there is a protection in the market. For us, as I say, one of the main challenges that we are facing for this type of sector in Spain is, I mentioned the prices and how social clauses still are not fully used, and they are just intervened when there is a equality in prices. But also one of the main challenges we have in Spain, precisely for the non-for-profit sector, is the accreditation of your social goals. You know, one of the main problems we have in Spain is that we have created some type of reserve markets, and it is allowed for organizations with a social goal to compete on them, but there is not a legal certification when you are a social entity. So what is the problem on that? That sometimes you really have to justify your social goals with 100 tons of documents in many ways that really creates red tape when you are really trying to compete in a market. I think it was mentioned by a previous speaker, I think it was Rebecca probably, that was mentioning as well, you know, the difficulties and the high costs that are involved when you are trying to compete in this type of markets. Imagine if you have to justify with 200 documents more that you are really an organization which is a non-for-profit. So that is the reason why some regions, for example, Madrid, Basque Country, Valencia, Canary Islands, they have already created a register with this certification system, but it's not existing in all communities and regions. So this is really a big issue for us. The one also of the problems that we are finding for the reserve markets is also that sometimes regions are really creating big contracts, really enormous big contracts, which does not allow to small service providers on social services to compete. So for us, a parcelation, a division, let's say, on those contracts would have been much better for the sector, because as I said, some of them are competing at local level, but some regions, for example, they procure the whole cleaning services for the whole region, and this does not allow really the capacity for a small service provider to compete in that market. The before last, let's say challenge for us is the capacity, as I mentioned before, of the local governments to understand the regulations and the national regulations and coming from the directive. For us, is really a big issue. The diversity, and Marnix was mentioning that for the Netherlands, is exactly the same in Spain. The huge diversity and how it is implemented at the local level creates big problems. And the last question for us, as I think is a good practice also in Spain, is that really prices now are forced to be applied based on the collective agreements for salaries, which is also important in our case in Spain, because sometimes we have seen competition even between the same inside the sector, that they play also with the money they receive in salaries, and this is really a bad practice that we need to be careful also in Spain, and I guess in other countries. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Javier, for another clear overview. It does a bit seem to me, though, that we're trying to put one funding model, reserved markets, which is in spirit, in some ways, the opposite of public procurement. It's not about, well, opposite depends how you define it, but it's not focusing so much on competition. It's focusing on the local providers and their engagement in local communities, especially with service users. which exist often for historical reasons. So it seems a bit like we're trying to force, let's say, reserved markets, one model, into the limitations that public procurement provides. And I know that in the EU Public Procurement Directive, reserved markets are feasible, but they also have limitations. So a question maybe for Anna, why can't we just leave social services out of the Public Procurement Directive and just have legislation focusing on reserved markets with the flexibility that works? So that's a first question. But the second is also that I know that the Commission is trying to work on improving the use of public procurement, including in the social field. Maybe a guidance note. But is a guidance, what are you doing in terms of the guidance note that you're preparing? But is that enough? What are the next steps? How can we make sure that the different authorities use public procurement in the right way? Anna.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, maybe I'll start with the more difficult question, which is, why can't we leave out social services from the directives? There are many considerations, some of a more political nature, if you want, from a purely like internal market perspective. I would say we need some rules to ensure, at the very least, some transparency and some non-discrimination in the field of public procurement, because our public authorities will continue to use public contracts for to provide these services anyway. So I think it's in the interest not only of the public authorities, but also in the interest of service providers and of users, that there is a minimum transparency when these contracts are being tendered out, because that guarantees, at the very least, that there is no major way to discriminate against certain providers, and that in general the population at large is aware of, or can be informed about the fact that there are opportunities being tendered out there. So that is the main reason. I would say, in terms of the guidance, and I see that there are also a few questions that have been posted on this topic. As most of you may know, we have been working quite intensively on guidance on social considerations, and the guidance should also include some indications concerning precisely social services and the use of EU rules on social services. We've had also a very good dialogue with some member states authorities who were quite proactive with us on the topic, and this has really helped in a way to push our boundaries in a sense. So we will be able, hopefully, to give a few more indications that we would have thought initially on social services. Right now, we have a draft guidance. We've been discussing internally on the possibility of having a stakeholder consultation on the draft, which we think would be very important, because whenever we've discussed specific topics with different stakeholders, it has only helped us to enrich the recommendations in the guide. So collecting some comments would be great, but let's say that at the moment, and also because of the crisis, things have slowed down a bit. So, but hopefully, fingers crossed, we might be able to launch a consultation on that and then proceed to adoption. I don't know if that answers all the questions, because I see there are quite a few also other questions that I'm happy to reply to, of course.
Yeah, we may quickly come back to that. Thank you, Anna. It's a difficult one for us in terms of publishing that guidance. Another public consultation could make sense in some ways. but also we've been discussing this guidance for 2 years now, I think. And there's a big issue, is including after the COVID, that if we don't promote the guidance as soon as possible, then in the follow-up to this crisis that we get now, member states use public procurement in the wrong way to further cut social services. So I think that's something that we should discuss also and take into consideration. Not to always postpone it, because we need to make it perfect, but we also make sure that action is taken out there and as soon as possible to improve the use of the services. So it's a balance to be found, I think. I have a question maybe for Javier about the myth of competition. A colleague from Scotland highlighted in the questions, how do we effectively challenge the myth that competition drives quality and innovation in social services? I know that in Spain, that's a big debate always between the non-profits and the for-profit organizations. So how do you tackle this issue, Javier?
Thank you, Thomas. I'm not sure I have understood your question properly, but you're asking me how the quality is also included in the reserve markets, in the reserve contracts.
No, I'm asking a bit more about the issue, the topic that competition in social services, fighting for contracts between non-profits, for-profit, etc., can only lead to better quality services and innovation. I think many in our field, and particularly non-profits, don't agree with that. I know there are many discussions in Spain about, is competition really good, particularly between the for-profit and the non-profit organizations? How do you deal with that issue in Spain, in particular in the ONCE group?
Yeah. Well, I think I need to agree with the issue that really competition is not always leading to better quality. I mean, definitely, when I started my intervention, I mentioned also that in many cases competition and prices, for example, in the way competition is conceived, in many ways through prices, is not really bringing good quality. I mean, obviously, if we include in the competition the quality criteria, for example, definitely maybe that competition could lead to better quality. But definitely for us, it is very clear that competition, by the fact of competition, is not really always bringing to quality. That definitely is something I think we should accept in many social services. On the contrary, it is true that when we are discussing about non-for-profit, we really believe that that quality in not-for-profit organizations is not always automatic, but it is true that when organizations are not just competing to have a benefit, a profit, let's say, for the owner of the company, in a ways, it's not always. It could also lead to a better quality in the services, because, for example, you are not really focusing on having a benefit, you are really focusing on the population you are serving as an organization which is not for profit. So in many ways, quality could be linked to that fact of focusing on your population that you are really attending or you are really supporting through your social service. So in a way for us, not-for-profit could be an indicator of better quality. But it is not really exclusive. I mean, we need to be also clear and we need to be also very critical with our sector. And we need to really get a commitment with quality, even if we are not for profit, because sometimes not for profit is just automatically considered as a good quality. And this is not 100% reality as well. So let me just, sorry, Thomas, I don't know if I made a big mess in the answer, but definitely for us, competition does not lead immediately to quality, but not for profit does not lead as well automatically to quality. We need to make an effort in both sectors for getting to that better support for populations. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier, for that. Marnix, a question for you. Anna talked a bit about what the Commission is planning in terms of making sure public procurement can work in social services. Is that sufficient for the Dutch authorities? What should they do? There have been some recommendations about extending the threshold. I talked about maybe removing social services completely. There's also a question about making sure that the Commission insists even more on quality criteria. What is your take on that, Marnix?
Sorry, I had to unmute my microphone. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, this is the question I think that is quite important for the Netherlands. Let me first start by saying something else. We've been talking about a lot of sort of technical issues on how to procure and how can you arrange cooperation between parties, how can you fulfill the requirements of the recipients of services, etc., etc. But the question that we haven't discussed this morning is, why do we have these procurement rules? It's to open up the European market. But if there is no European market, if there is no cross-border interest for these services, as we see in the Netherlands, there are no foreign service providers active in the field of social health services in the Netherlands. So why are we applying this rules framework if we don't reap any benefits from it? So that's more of an abstract or principle question. And well, Anna knows we've been discussing this with the European Commission as well, and actually the Dutch government is pushing for a evaluation of the Public Procurement Directive, and to well, our goal is to go back to the sort of former Public Procurement Directive, where social services were not under the direct scope of the directive. But let me get back to your question. An important thing for us would also be to get some more guidance from the European Commission, on the as long as the directive hasn't been evaluated or adapted, on the how do we actually apply that formal framework? How can we arrange the cooperation between parties, etc.? And I know that the European Commission has been working hard on the guidelines on socially responsible procurement. That's actually a different topic, and both topics are equally important. But I'm hoping and I'm urging the European Commission to take into to put into the guidelines also some more effort on these social services and how to procure them, and how to tackle the problems that we've been talking about, for public authorities, for service providers, for recipients, to take away these problems. Does that answer your question, Thomas?
Yes, it does, quite very, very clearly. I would now ask maybe Javier, and then I will conclude with Anna. What should the Commission do on this? Or is it just, let's say, work that needs to be done now at national or regional level? What do you think about this?
Thank you, Thomas. Well, I think it's very important, the guidelines that we have mentioned before. I think it is as I say, for us, the main challenge now is the differences in interpretation of the capacity of using these regulations. And this is creating a problem in the market, because it is creating insecurity in many ways in the interpretation that would be, let's say, used by the local authority or by the region or by the state. So in a way, having those guidelines could really support on that. At the same time, I think it is also very important, although probably, as Anna has mentioned, it is an issue to have a specific regulation or directive for reserve contracts. It is definitely also a good idea to have from the European Commission some indications on how this should be really implemented, because in a way, this would really help in many ways to do an interpretation at national level. I think the more we are clear in some of the elements that are included in the current directive and in the transposition that has been done at national level, the better it will be to ensure some of the criteria that we have mentioned here during the different interventions. For example, quality, for example, the social impact, how to measure really the criteria. So in many ways, I think the Commission could go further on that. I think also exploring the connection with other parts of the private procurement, which is influenced, for example, the competition rules, like, you know, reserve contracts, etc. In my opinion, also the synergies between those types of regulations and directives would be also very important to be explored, and to make some type of confidence and to be confident, let's say, to operate in this type of market, though we cannot really change, I guess, regulations and directives at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. So I think to make it a bit simpler, we have a clear message for Anna. We need more and stronger support and guidance from the Commission to make sure that the social criteria and all those elements are really taken into account in the use of public procurement across Europe. So a stronger role for the Commission providing that guidance, because it leaves currently too much flexibility for member states. So, and for my take, and this is not EASPD's take, but I'm not sure another public consultation on this topic is needed. I think we've had 2 years of this engagement. I think the need for it is clear, and hopefully it can be launched as soon as possible. But this is, of course, just a personal statement and not from EASPD. Anna, would you like to make a final word, and then we can maybe move on to the next session? Do you think this is feasible to have something within the next few months?
That will largely depend. Also on the crisis, because there are. I don't want to I don't know actually that much about it, but right now there's quite a bit of focus internally on the response to the crisis. Of course, we also see social considerations and in the approach to social service, to procurement of social services, as something that's essential in terms of responding to the crisis, because the crisis will create many social issues, of course, or will intensify the ones that are already present in our communities. So we're putting forward that kind of argument also with our political masters. But I would say that things are pretty much ready to roll. We are facing a bit of internal bureaucracy at the moment. So hopefully we think it's not worth in any case to keep what we have right now on the shelf, because it could benefit many public buyers out there. So we are trying to do our best to publish as soon as possible.
Thank you, Anna. And I think that's a clear message from at least all the panelists here that you have our full support to try and make it happen as soon as possible. So if you could take that message to your, as you say, political masters, that would be great. Yeah. Great. So we're a bit behind. I promised to be on time, but we're a bit behind. But I think that was interesting. And of course, we covered reserved markets in a discussion on public procurement because there are strong interlinks. But of course, reserved markets don't have to be done only within public procurement rules. They could be totally separate, let's say, regulations in national law, and therefore there can be a lot more flexibility in how this is done. What we mean by reserved market is basically when a public authority reserves the contracts to one or several organizations providing social services and doesn't open up the contract to, let's say, the open market. Generally, this means reserving it for not-for-profit organizations. So I will then go straight to our next panel, where we have Laura Jones, who is Secretary General of the European Platform for Rehabilitation. We have Jakob, my German is not very good, Ombacher, who represents the European Federation of Public Service Unions, so the trade union for many of the workers in the field of social services. And we also have Karin Astiger, who works for Lebenshilfe Austria, which is a service provider for people with learning disabilities in Austria. Laura, first question for you. What differentiates care provision to other sectors? Why are reserved markets important in social services?
Thank you, Thomas. So I decided I would make comments with 4 R's. So I'm going to talk briefly about rights, relationships, reach, and responsibilities. Some factors that I think distinguish the social care sector from other sectors, as well as the market itself. So if I would start with rights, we know that social services aim to fulfill rights of the service users or the people in need of support services. The enablers of rights, this role is seen in the European Pillar of Social Rights. We're pleased that that role has been recognized there. And therefore, this means that quality is essential to achieve the goal of these services, to meet the needs of the users and their fundamental rights. And compared to other sectors, there are issues around quality of life and dignity, that these services have a fundamental impact on the well-being and the quality of life of an individual. Linked to this, that also means there is a large proportion of not-for-profit, or let's say also value-based organizations that believe in these rights and supporting these rights. Then we could say, in terms of relationship, we've already touched on this. So the relationship between the staff and the service user or person with support needs is a key dimension of the quality of the service, and has a very big then impact on what I mentioned before, on whether the person's rights are met, on their quality of life. So the interactions between the service provider and the service user or person in need of support are key, and therefore quality in that field is really essential, because the services are delivered to, you could say, or with the person directly, which distinguishes it from most other sectors. There are many similarities with healthcare, of course, but it's important to emphasize that. And therefore the staff qualifications, experience, attitude are extremely important in this sector. We were disappointed that it's not possible in the technical specifications in procurement to ask for specific qualifications. And it can be seen as a kind of historically asymmetrical relationship, as it's been called also in some materials, that the provider has potentially a position of power over the service user. Obviously, this is not a relationship that we want to see, but it is possible that this happens, and we would promote a co-production approach that would ensure that the service user is empowered, but there is that risk that is distinguishing it from many other sectors. Then in terms of reach, we also had some of these issues mentioned already. According to the European Commission in the directive, it says that social services have a limited cross-border dimension. And that is also why that the special regime for social services was created in the current Public Procurement Directive. It has this lighter regime, lighter rules. So that is one thing that we still believe it distinguishes it from other sectors. Another point that's been raised, I'll re-emphasize, is the local dimension of many services, the importance of a service provider understanding the local context, the local service users, and sometimes that also has to do with cultural traditions. So these elements also can distinguish this sector from other sectors. And the reason why different forms of reserve markets are allowed is also because, as also written in the directive, that, for example, social businesses may not be able to obtain contracts under normal conditions. So it's recognized that the type of organizations active in this sector deserve a kind of special dispensation, that they need this extra support that we've spoken about to enable them to fulfill their goals and to provide quality support services. And then finally, in terms of responsibility, because of the nature of these services, the personal nature, the importance of the service in terms of somebody's quality of life and dignity, that means that the government has a specific responsibility, that these kind of services cannot be left just for the market to provide them. People's needs are often outside their own control through accidents or through unemployment. And also people with the most needs may often have the least means or the least money funding to be able to then buy services if that was the system. So it's essential that the government has this responsibility, does have this responsibility, and acts on this responsibility to ensure that all who need quality services can get access to quality services. That's why they're seen as like a service of general interest in this context. And yeah, just to add one more thing about quality, there is a challenge in what is quality, how to define quality, how to understand quality. In some countries, they have required a certain quality certification that helps guarantee a certain level of quality. For example, in Norway, which we've heard about already, in the vocational rehabilitation sector, they require either the EQUAS certification, which was created by my organization, or the ISO certification. So they've recognized the importance of quality, and they've tried to find a way of kind of outsourcing the understanding of quality to organizations that are more specialized. But yeah, so I would say rights, relationships, reach and responsibilities are 4 characteristics that distinguish this sector from other markets. Then,
Thank you, Laura, for that. I will quickly move on, if that's okay, to maybe Jakob, if he's online. I can't see him right now.
Can you hear me?
But, yeah, I can hear you. Great, perfect. So Jakob, you represent the European, let's say the main European trade union organization, which has members in the field of social care. Why is it important that workers have a say in on how the sector is funded? How does this affect workers? And based on the discussions that we've had today, what do you think is better for the sector? Public procurement, reserved markets, or maybe even in-house? Be good to have your thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. I'm very happy to be able to also bring in the perspective of trade unions, because we're convinced that the quality of work and the quality of services are linked very strongly, and that recruitment and retention of a skilled and motivated workforce are absolutely necessary also for high quality public services. Just to begin with, maybe we had actually commissioned research in the current state of affairs. Also, so maybe to give a quick overview, we see a rising share of for-profit care providers, also a concentration of ownership among multinational corporations such as Orpea and Korean. And often these type of for-profit providers are able to, from a purely financial point of view, bring cheaper offers. However, we believe it's very necessary to also look at the hidden costs of such offers. Such multinational corporations or for-profit providers can often shift profits to avoid paying company taxes. They tend to focus on the most profitable services, so oftentimes close or in wealthier cities, which leads to economic and regional inequalities in access. Oftentimes, as we heard before from Ms. Matihildi, investors only own facilities for 4 or 5 years. In Germany, we heard that the average for investors to own care homes is 4.5 years and then sell them on for profit, which creates massive problems for continuity of services and staff. There is a high pressure to make savings. We have reports from the UK where care homes, the average cost for food per resident per day is £2.20. So I think it's, we can only imagine the quality of this food. And it also causes massive downward pressure on salaries, which in social services are the biggest cost factor. So to respond to questions about reserved markets, we definitely believe that reserved markets can bring improvements compared to like a certain free-for-all type of competition. It can ease pressure of non-profits to compete on the terms dictated by multinational corporations. It can lower the pressure to increase returns at all costs. And often they're better embedded in the community. However, I think it's also true what Javier said before, that it's not automatic that non-profits provide necessarily better services. It's still important to really ensure continuity, to look at long-term partnerships that prevent the high turnover of staff as well as ownership. In terms of the workers, we think that it's very important that contracting authorities and employers include pay clauses in their contracting. So contracts, employers, people who offer bids always need to respect collective agreements to prevent that the salary for workers becomes the main factor of savings. We social partners need to be involved in drafting the rules on procurement on a national level. And and lastly, I believe that it's important to see that costs must be considered in the long run and not just a short-term snapshot. So we need to include the hidden costs that I just mentioned, and priority must be given to actors that ensure stability, continuity, and respect industrial relations and workers' rights.
Thank you very much, Jakob, for a very clear overview of how it affects workers. I may come back to you on a few points there later, but I would ask a question to Karin Astiger, who works for quite a large non-profit organization in Austria. Reserved markets seem great for non-profit organizations who have existed for many years, who provide the service on a day-to-day basis. It also seems maybe a little easy for them. How can we make sure that reserved markets and this, let's say, partnership approach between the authorities, that there's sufficient pressure on the providers to improve what they're doing, to be more user-driven, to use co-production services, to make sure that the workers have work in good conditions. What if a new player wants to come in and can provide better quality services? How does that work? Or should we, just because not-for-profit organizations are not-for-profit, we should reserve it for those that exist already? Just want to know a few of your thoughts on that.
Thanks,
not the
Tom.
easiest question, but
not exactly the easiest one, but let me start with saying that I've made an interesting personal development through the last couple of years when we had so intensive discussions about the advantages and disadvantages about the different funding models. So I must say that through these discussions, I'm actually more able to see the positive aspects or the advantages of the reserved market model more than in the past, because I think we are used to the positive aspects and we easily take them for granted and focus on critical issues. So at least that's my role as the person responsible for research and development in my organization. So let's say I would say that quality aspects, at least in terms of innovation and moving towards new models, is quite a challenge for the reserved market model, because its advantage is clearly in stability, continuity, providing all those things that you mentioned already. But this also means it's pretty reluctant to change. So when we want to drive our services in the direction of more person-centeredness, of making them better able to work as human rights enablers, then we have to make a kind of extra effort, or partly we also have to work kind of around rules and details of contracts to make that happen. So I think that's quite challenging. Also, it's quite challenging to give choice and control to service users in a comparable amount as they would have with personal budgets and personal assistance. And I can say that because my organization also provides a small amount of services with the personal assistance model, working with personal budgets. So there is big advantages to be seen here. I would say it's easier about the good working conditions. Actually, I would say it's one of the things we can really take care of in an orderly manner. Because we have this kind of contracts and this kind of funding where our actual costs are being the basis of our funding. So they are calculated basically as rates by service user per day. And so our staff costs are covered with that. And of course, like this stability, continuity. It gives us a reliable planning situation, not only financially, but also in terms of long-term support or personal plans for service users. So I would say it's rather positive or easy with that. And we mentioned already today our current situation with the crisis, and we had a EASPD board meeting yesterday, and I heard many of my colleagues from other countries telling very difficult situation. And I must say that in my region, we don't have any funding problems. The services are open. We are being paid for all service users, independent of whether they attend the services currently or prefer to stay with their families for safety reasons. And we also, our sector and our staff get a lot of appreciation from the public and also from the authorities. And as the colleague from the trade unions just mentioned, the contracts, the union contracts are very important. And just before the crisis, we've had long-standing kind of bargaining, and it was kind of stuck. And now during the crisis, the update of the contract has been finalized, and taking into account most of the needs and wishes that had been formulated by staff in terms of remuneration and also in terms of some specific working conditions. And there was also kind of an agreement that they get extra payment for the difficult work during the crisis. So I would say all in all, yes, a challenge in terms of quality, especially in terms of innovation. On the other hand, I think that we have a rather good basis for providing reasonable working conditions for our staff.
Thank you, Karen. So I will then ask maybe quite a difficult question for Jakob. It seems to me that reserved markets place workers' rights ahead of users' rights, potentially, for the sake of provocation. What do you think of that? Is that the right way forward? Are our priorities right? Bit of a tough question, but hopefully you could provide your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you for this question. I don't believe that there is a opposition between workers' rights and users' rights. On the contrary, I believe they very much go together. I think one of the most significant problems in the care sector is the recruitment and retention of a skilled workforce. We heard before from Mrs. Sorry, if I'm not pronouncing it right, Matahaldi, that there is a high turnover of staff. New staff that comes in maybe is not aware of the needs of workers. And I believe that the problem of recruitment and retention is well known. It also has been presented by the European Commission in a report in 2014, which says, I quote, at present wages in the sector are low and working conditions.
We can't hear you anymore, Jakob, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was just reading this quote from the European Commission Social Protection Committee in 2014 that links recruitment and retention problems to low wages and unattractive working conditions. So I believe that workers' rights and the rights of the people in need of care and support are very much linked, and I don't believe that there is an opposition between the two.
Okay, thank you, Jakob. Clear answer there. We may come back to that later. Laura, you had a few more comments to make about reserved markets, and I would have maybe an additional question to you is, if reserved markets very often don't provide more user control or control of service beneficiaries than public procurement, is it again from the user's perspective just the same? Basically lack of choice, lack of control, lack of influence over the services? Is there really a difference from the user's perspective between public procurement and reserved markets?
Thanks, Thomas. So I think there are quite a few different models that we're talking about under the, let's say, name of reserved markets. There are some we've spoken a bit more about, specifically reserving markets for organizations that employ disadvantaged people. That's in the directive specifically, sheltered employment and sheltered workshops. There's also specific possibility to reserve markets for social services for mutual companies and social enterprises for a limited period. There's also the possibility, but it's more complicated to do legally, which is to reserve markets to non-profits in general. Then, I mean, the Commission has said it has to be justified on the basis of if it is necessary and proportionate to attain certain social objectives pursued by the national social welfare system. So if you want to reserve a market where you still have competition, but you open just for non-profits, then you really have to justify it well at national level by saying that it serves the purpose of your social welfare system. And then we've also talked about, in this last session, what I would also call like the grant and subsidy method, where there is no competition at all. Then we also have the model, which is we've referred to in the report as open house, but also can be referred to as licensing or authorization. And that is enabling choice. So that is a system where you agree to a certain number of providers that are able to operate on the market, and then the service user can choose. And the German system is similar to that. And you mentioned the Dutch system in the report as well. Yeah, there are challenges with what we've been focusing on as reserve market in terms of like grants and subsidies, the direct financial support without competition that were mentioned by the previous speaker. But with all systems, it really depends on how you manage that process. There's always better ways or worse ways of doing something, and the more effort put into the process, the better the outcome can be. So even within a grant or subsidy system, you could still put requirements for quality in there. You could still either the public authority with the provider, or to bring in an external certification or procedure to guarantee the quality for the service users. And your question about if the only, let's say, or the best system is always involving choice, is that more or less your question? Could you?
No, my question is, if I was, let's say, a person with a disability in a care home, what difference is there between reserved markets and public procurement? Because effectively, in most cases, reserved markets is again negotiations, a partnership between service providers and public authorities. Public procurement is organized differently, but a similar relationship. So is there really, what is the added value of reserved markets? At least public procurements provide more competition potentially.
Well, reserve markets in themselves, if you take the broad definition, don't exclude competition, because you can have competition between social enterprises in one form, or you can have then competition between non-profit organizations. So it really depends on how that process is run by the public authority. But then I think you could say that the added value of the non-profit organizations that we've already heard about can bring that added dimension to the service user. Organizations that really believe in the rights of an individual, that they want to support access to rights, that they have a long-term commitment to the community, to the service users. Their mission and vision is purely social. So then you ensure that you have that added value in the provision of the social service. So and that you could say also, if you have a grant or subsidy scheme, that you ensure that the organization that's providing those services really has a commitment to the service users and the individual, but then you have to ensure that that organization really is up to a certain standard. So it involves more close supervision, you could say, to make sure that the service users' interests and needs are met by that. So it depends how you organize the process. as we said, competition doesn't always bring quality either. It's because it depends how that's managed. You really have to know what you're doing to ensure that quality service is the outcome of a project, public procurement procedure. So I think they all have their challenges in ensuring quality. But if you're able to define quality that a service user would identify with, then all systems can ensure that they are having their needs met, that they should be involved in the process. If co-production is a requirement, then that can ensure that with any of the systems, there's a benefit and that the service user has a high quality service. If that answers your question.
It does in some ways. I have a question, but we will talk more about that later with personal budgets, I think. A question for Karen. We have a question here from Brigitte, which asks, shouldn't offer and demand essentially be a determining criteria? Users who are satisfied. Shouldn't that be an essential criterion? What do you think about that? But also, what would be the negative consequences of only focusing on the satisfaction of service users, for example? Or are there any? Karen?
Well, I must say that for our services, the satisfaction of service users is very important. So we evaluate that in regular terms, and we have been working for the last 10 years with a system of training service users as peer interviewers. So they are conducting the interviews with other service users, and which render very valuable results. But this is within the service provider. We are not obliged by the authorities to do that or whatever. We share the results. The authorities as well, they check on the quality of the NGOs that provide services, and we also have independent bodies, like, for example, due to the UN Convention or different national laws, they check on quality of the services. So I think it is a very important aspect. The reality in our region is that service users don't have too much of a choice. I mean, there are some providers, and also the amount of services that those providers can provide is rather limited. So we have partly waiting lists. So I think in theory they could choose between the service providers they are available. In practice, it's rather limited. I wished this was more. This is something that we are really asking for. But I think you would have, independent of the number of providers, but you would have to offer as authority a much higher number of places or services than are needed. Then service users could choose, and then their satisfaction with certain providers could be maybe the main source for their decision where to get the services.
Thank you, Karen, for that overview. I may ask you later also on the section on personal budgets to come in, because you mentioned that you were testing it in your country, and I think it'd be interesting to get your perspectives there. So my take on reserved markets, because I know we're moving forward quite a lot with time, is on the one side it provides stability, in most cases continuity for the social services system. Basic quality elements are respected, especially in the case where there's like a licensing system that happens. But again, and I'm trying to transition before the next panel, is that it's not focusing on the exact needs and users. That's not the focus of these models, at least maybe not so sufficiently. You mentioned, Karen, that you did some steps in terms of looking into user preferences and decisions and so forth, but these were not compulsory by your authorities, which I personally don't always understand how that is the case, or at least how it's in line with the UN Convention, but that appears to be the case. So the real weakness here is that both with public procurement and with reserved markets, in many cases, the choice and control, the opinion of the service user is not sufficiently taken into account. And here we have another model which is growing across Europe, personal budgets. It has many different names in Europe, and it's used in different ways. But basically, it's when the money, instead of the public money going straight to the service providers, the money is going to people with disabilities who then choose the service how they wish to provide. So quite a big shift in how it's how the organization is how it's the system is organized, with challenges but also many opportunities. And what's particularly interesting is really the power balance, how it changes the power balance between service users and organizations. So not to be too negative on the reserved markets, but I do feel that there's a big challenge there with that model, and really making the next steps. Personal budgets. So now we have another panel on this issue. We have 3 different speakers. Irene Beltana from COFACE Families Europe, representing family organizations. We have Hayden Hammersley from the European Disability Forum, representing what's the main European organization representing people with disabilities in Europe. And we also have Frank Sion from the European Network on Independent Living, which is pushing very strongly on personal budgets, personal assistance systems, are one of the leading organizations there. So if I may, I will start straight away with you, Frank. It was mentioned earlier in the presentation by Rebecca that personal budgets are particularly useful or work particularly easily or easier for people with physical disabilities or mobility impairments. It seems to be a bit of a different story for people with more support needs, particularly people with intellectual disabilities. Do you really see personal budgets as working for all people with disabilities? And if so, how can that be done?
Hey Thomas, hi all. Thanks for the question. It's really interesting, and Inel has been also working on this quite a bit. The answer is yes. The system of personal assistance can work for everybody. The system of personal budgets can work for everybody. However, the support that people receive will be different. For some people, the support that they need to operate the personal assistance budget might be different than to others. And I think what we really need to do here is to change the way we look at the issue. As was said also at the start, oftentimes we take the ability to communicate as kind of the cutoff point for people who can manage or cannot manage personal assistance. And we then think, okay, in most systems, it is said that, okay, if a person cannot make their preferences clear and do the management, then it can be difficult to give this person personal budgets. What we say is, okay, look at it differently, and think, how can the person be supported to be able to make these decisions and to use the personal budget. And there we see that there are different initiatives, like in Sweden from our member IAC. They have set up a system which is called the service guarantor, which means that a person has a personal assistance and a service guarantor, which is another person who is well aware of the needs and preferences of the person with disability and is to a certain extent trusted and can communicate with the person. This service guarantor then takes into account all the administration, all the kind of contract administration, legal side of things. It's kind of a proxy person. And the personal assistance then provides the support. However, with our member IAC, with the NGO, there is a monthly meeting where the person with disability, the service guarantor, and the IAC come together to see if the system is still working for the person, if the person's preferences are still respected. If this is not the case, the service provider, the service guarantor, or the personal assistant can be changed. So I'm explaining it really in a super tiny nutshell here, because the lack of time. But on our website you find more information about that. A similar system is the microboards, where again you have, which is used in Australia and Canada most of the time, where again you have an NGO which is set up around a person with disability with a specific goal to make sure that the needs and preferences of the person are respected and taken into account to the highest extent possible. The budget then goes to the NGO. So again, the funding goes to the person, not to the public, to the government or to a service provider, but to a personal NGO. And also in the working of the NGO is monitored by like an umbrella, which is called a VILA. So again, you have the same principle that you have an NGO which is set up around the preferences of the person, and the autonomy of the person is actually safeguarded also externally by another NGO which is kind of monitoring the process to make sure that the assistants don't take over, so to say. So in a nutshell again, yes, it works for everybody, but the support needs for a person, well, the support that the person needs to manage the assistance can be different. We have touched also on more concrete examples of this today. Also for myself, for instance, I use personal assistants, but I have my mother who is doing the finances of it, and who I pay with my personal assistant budget to do the finances for that, because I do not want to do it. I do not want the responsibility, but I have trust that my mother will you know, support it and do it well. If my mother stops doing it, I might go to a bookkeeping company. But just this extra support that I need in terms of bookkeeping and managing the progress allows me to use personal assistants effectively. This again can also be applied to the principle of too much choice. You know, maybe if a person has too much choice, as I have some persons that I know who struggle with this issue, it might be difficult to use the personal assistance budget effectively. But then, rather than saying that this person cannot use personal assistance, we should look at how can we support the person to make effective use of the choices, like what kind of support services are needed. And the good thing is that in all the countries, those support structures are already existing. They're just not operating within the PA budget yet. You have services that help people with planning their day. You have services that support people in making a personal support plan. So these services are there, but they are now still operating in a service provider offers a service to a person perspective, rather than a person with a personal budget can go to the service to ask for assistance for this particular thing. So I think when we change the mindset, both on the communication and also in how support is provided, then yes, personal assistance and personal budgets can work for all.
Thank you.
And I hope this was
Frank.
within 5 minutes.
It's a good summary in 5 minutes. I may come back to you with a tricky question later, as that's part of my job. I'm trying to create cover all the angles here. And maybe also for you now, Irene, you represent families. We heard, for example, that, or even a personal experience from Frank, that it's his mother who uses the bookkeeping in this case, but of course, all families is different in many different cases. But how do you see this issue of personal budgets? Is it really the solution to all problems?
Well, this is a tricky question indeed, and the answer can be only no. I mean, the solution to all problems is not in one kind of provision, but for sure, personal budget have a lot of positive points. I mean, I think that what is very interesting and unique about personal budget is that they are radicated into human rights law. So it's the only system born with the purpose of giving choice, control, autonomy, citizenship, and participation to the people with disabilities, and also to their families, because it is the only system that gives the possibility to the person with disability to pay, recognize the care person, who is often the mother, who is often out of the labor market due to the fact that the child has a disability. So for sure, personal budget is an interesting model which need to be built in a way which ensures that all families are covered, because of course there are risks. Some risks were said by Frank. For sure, there is a management and administrative burden which might or not, depending on how the service, the provision is organized, lay in the hands of the family members and of the person with disability. But this is not something that you cannot avoid in case you want to avoid it, because there are models where the state or some platforms enter in the picture and do guide and also take the administrative burden out from the family. So it's really a matter of what is the political will behind the building of this system. If the political will is about ensuring rights for all, then there will be systems that support the people. For example, persons with intellectual disabilities indeed are also targets, possible targets for personal budgets. And there again, if there is guidance, if there is supported decision making, these can be very useful. Also because it is proven that personal budgets are there for those families and persons with disability who are not, whose needs are not met by the services available. So for the people, for example, living in rural areas where you don't have services, or people with needs that are not met by the services in places, can, through personal budget, find really the service that can fulfill their life. Just another point that makes me a supporter of this model, of course, in a spectrum where you have also other provision, and in a vision where we are in a transition, is the fact, I lost it. Yeah, well, the transparency and the flexibility of the system. What can be problematic is, from the perspective of the service provider, the investment in the managing of this kind of change. So this also needs to be taken into account into the funding. And again, with systems that don't leave the burden in someone, meaning the user and the service, but where the states plays a role of coordination, of regulation, and of assistance.
Thank you, Irene. If it's okay, I will now move on to a question where I want to be able to intervene, if that's okay. Yeah. I have a question now for Hayden. What if Frank and Irene are wrong? What if personal budgets do not work in many cases, in all cases? What could happen if, for example, and there are accusations that personal budgets lead to, let's say, extreme liberalization of social care, and has a major impact over the existence of certain forms of service provision for people with certain types of disabilities. So just your thoughts on that.
Hi. So yeah, I mean, it's true that it's a system where competition primes, but I mean, I think also from our perspective at the European Disability Forum, we also see it as something very positive, because yes, it's competition, but it's really competition that's based on quality of service and on how happy service users are with the service that they get. I think if we talk about liberalization in this more economic term, I would say it even goes to do the opposite. So, I mean, we've seen lots of concerns in certain countries with the way that the public procurement system works, especially when there are tenders, calls for tenders by public authorities, by municipalities. I know in Finland, for example, there was a lot of concern about how this was done. Even after the EU directive on public procurement from 2014, which was meant to kind of do the opposite and put more focus on quality of service rather than on how far the money went and how kind of how cheap the service was, or how how cost efficient it was. In Finland, we saw almost the opposite happen, where there was more focus going on how far the money spent could go in terms of hours of assistance, and less on quality. So in this sense, I would say it really goes to do the opposite, actually, when you get a personal budget. it not only guarantees that it gives the best possibility that the person using the service will get the type of quality of service that they want. It also gives more power to have a kind of continuity of service. So you build up a rapport with the person providing assistance to you, and this can go on for a longer time. Whereas when you have support through an agency, for example, there can be high turnover. You end up having many different people supporting you due to this quick turnover. Yeah, so in this sense, I would say it really has a positive influence for focusing more on quality, on building genuine trust and a good relationship between care provider and service user. So yeah, I see it not as an extreme liberalization of the market, but more on something that really focuses on good quality service.
Thank you, Hayden. I have a question now. We were meant to have Jim Crow, the president of EASPD, to come in and talk about his knowledge of the system in the UK, but unfortunately he's unable to join us. Karen, maybe you could come in if that's okay.
If it's not about the UK, then it's okay.
Definitely not about the UK. No, it's about how personal budgets, they have huge impact over how service providers are organized, funded, also over the type of services that are being provided. Can also be challenging for many workers in some situations. I mean, what is your experience as in Disabilities or even your own understanding of the topic? Personal budgets, do they work for everyone? Are there any limitations to it? What are the downsides potentially?
Well, I'm very much with Frank and Irene. I think it works for everyone. We are providing personal assistance only for persons with intellectual disability, my organization. And the reason why we as a service provider are working as one of the intermediaries, doing what Frank was telling about his mother, that we are doing this employer role for the persons receiving assistance, but kind of they select their assistants, they do all that, and we kind of help if there is help needed, and we do this financial part and the employer role. So this works very well. We've had fantastic results. I mean, we've had this pilot project in my region only since for 2.5 years now, roughly, and it's very successful. People have much better.
What is stopping then the public authorities from expanding it? In many countries, it's been piloted for quite a while now, in Ireland, in Finland, in Austria. What's stopping authorities from spreading it out?
Well, I would say it's not limited to my region, but there is a big fear that costs might explode if you open up this kind of service for everyone. In my region, it's definitely, that's the reason why it's until now it's limited to like 25 people for the entire region, which is nothing. Of course, many more people who would love to have it. So it's this fear, but it's also the fear that you mentioned already, or that we had been discussing. Is it really possible for persons with intellectual disability? So actually the pilot project in my region is unique in Austria. It's the only region that allows persons with intellectual disabilities or people with mental health problems to use this kind of service. In all other regions, or for example, for personal assistance at the workplace, it's limited to persons with physical disabilities and is not open to these target groups. So this is another fear. And for example, for the pilot project, they really made very clear rules so that, for example, persons getting supported in group homes, for example, they are not they cannot apply in the pilot phase. It has to be people that so far lived at home, so no other kinds of support. And so they are kind of afraid that especially persons with higher support needs, as Frank mentioned, the approach of YAG, like I think they would be very afraid to open up the field really for persons are not able to communicate with verbal speech, that they would question whether they could really handle like the management of the personal assistance.
Thank you. Interesting, important thoughts there. Now a question for Frank. I've heard of it, and there's evidence in the report. It was mentioned by Rebecca earlier today. Personal budgets, not because of the concept always, but because of how it's implemented, have put sometimes a lot of pressure because they're not enough personal budget to each user. Puts pressure on of course the service user, the person with disability who wants to have their services met, to maybe potentially not prioritize the best types of working contracts for service users. These types of elements that basically personal budgets have a negative impact over the working rights for their carers, and also, you know, are they always taking into account, let's say, the collective agreements which are in place in social care provision, which are maybe not perfect, but they do provide certain basic working rights for many workers. Is there not a danger that personal budgets undermines social care workers?
No, because no, I think we touched upon, and also what was said by Epsu, I think is a very good point, that it goes hand in hand. Like, you need good working conditions to have good assistance. But I think all the points that we touched on are coming to the same points. Indeed, you have when you give personal budget to disabled people to manage their own assistance, then of course you have a supply and demand kind of process, which will make sure that people can continue to hire or employ the assistants that they like, that are providing good assistance, good quality assistance, and then this will bring this element into the market. And of course,
what about elements, if I may, just to challenge you a bit further, what about elements such as career paths for social care workers, training, what also about, I mean, sometimes being, you know, the hours that are needed to provide personal assistance are not always the most, let's say, family friendly. And it could be argued, and I'm oversimplifying for the sake of the discussion, that it's easier to organize decent working conditions in an institution than it is in terms of personal assistance. I'm being a bit provocative here, but it's an argument that I've heard many times before. So just for your thoughts there, really on the difficult angles of the question.
Yeah, no, definitely. So indeed, one of the challenges is that you then want to give people good working conditions. However, it was also seen in a survey done by Enel to our members, where we asked what is good personal assistance looking like, and choice and control was the first bit, but good working conditions for assistance was the second most important point. So also disabled people, they acknowledge this need and they want to give good working conditions. The big problem is that, as you say, maybe it is easier, you can control better your working schedules and everything in institutions, but the question is, do we want this? Does this give good quality support, and does this give good quality of life both for the disabled person and for the worker? And there the answer, I think, is no. So if we then want to have good and decent working conditions with personal assistance, what is blocking that? What is the problem? If disabled people want it, if workers want it, and we see the problem is basically that the governments are afraid to completely shift the system and the funding towards personal assistance, which always creates scarce funding to make sure you have the assistance you need. So maybe it is impossible to pay people for weekends or extra for weekends because you simply do not get enough PA budget for it. Maybe even it is in your personal support plan that you need more budget for weekends, but because there is only a limited budget available, you do not get extra budget for weekends, and therefore you cannot pay your assistant. So then what, as a user, as a disabled person, are your options? You can either not have support, not use the personal assistance that you have, or you can try and make as much use of it as possible with, less good contracts than you would like to give. And there, I think, is a big challenge for both for government to make it possible that in the PA system there is enough budget for people to, be able to give working conditions as in collective labor agreements, because disabled people also want to do this. But we see in many systems, including the Belgian one, that the collective labor agreements for PAs are very empty. They have not really many provisions in terms of weekend work and in terms of evening work, and the government does not check, the working conditions very well. But the reason the government does not check the working conditions is because they know that if they would check, many people would not be able to provide the working conditions, and then they would have to, say that their system isn't working and that they should give more money. We also see it in, European legislation. You had the working time directive and what is it, the one directive that you have to, write the workers' rights. And we had discussions with EPSU on that how do you make sure that it doesn't destroy personal assistance systems in countries where people cannot provide the conditions that are prescribed. Maybe it should be in the directive that, the member state should make sure that there is sufficient budget in the personal assistance budget system to allow people to provide the working conditions that they want.
Thank you.
And then
I know
one more point, or no? Okay.
Sorry, I need to move on. Maybe if you have time at the end, Frank. Sorry. Clear point there that but I think it's a crucial point here is how, and maybe the most difficult point is you also work within a system within the limitations that public authorities can both afford and organize in that way, and maybe because of the limitations, and it's often used, let's say, to cut down costs. That's my experience, at least in England and the UK. It doesn't really help to create good working or the ideal conditions for workers, at least how trade unions would see it. But we can maybe come back to that a bit later. But I think very important points made there by Frank. Irene, not the question that we had pre-discussed before, but an issue that's come up to me in the chat is, could personal budgets force family members to enter into low-pay jobs because they feel that they need to provide that support for their family member, and because now there is a budget to make it happen, they feel obliged to provide that job, and whereas they would prefer to maybe have another job rather than if it's their choice to care for their family member. So doesn't it put additional pressure on family members to care, to provide the care for their family member? And is it a risk that they're also at quite a low cost because of the limitations that sometimes personal budgets have?
No. I mean, I think that the situation now is that mostly family members that don't have the choice of providing the care to their children often, or other family members, and due to that they quit their job. They are with no recognition, and sometimes they have a very small contribution from the state. So that's the situation. We are talking about 80% of long-term care being provided informally by family members. I don't see personal budget pushing others to follow this path. I see this rather like answering to something which is unattended in a very strong way at European level. So the personal budget is one of, because it's not the only one. I mean, the recognition of the family carer can pass also through other systems, but the fact that the personal budget entails this, I see it more than an instrument that makes emerging something that is already happening. Also because one of the main points of the personal budget system is that the choice should be there. And so the choice in reality for now is a wish for many family carers. It's not the reality, it's just the only thing that they can do. So personally, I see more of an opportunity than a threat in this. And then, of course, again, everything stems in the end of those who design the budgets in a way that compensation is decent for both the workers and the family members and network. If there is, according to me, a real co-production spirit in those who design and handle these, all these problems should not be part of it. You also have systems which give a limited possibility of giving the personal assistance role to family members. So for sure, this is an issue. It's not something that should be left like this with no thinking. There is thinking that is needed about that. There is a risk of conflict of interest. There is risk of abuse. But the fact of putting this which is an informal reality happening a lot into a system where policymakers can really think about how to do it in the best way, I think it's a positive development potentially.
Thank you, Irena. I think a very clear and important answer. Many informal carers basically can't work because they have to provide the support and aren't even paid for it. So that's a very important point. Huge cost also for our economy. Now a question for Hayden, if I may. We recently were writing a project application on personal budgets. And what we saw was many public authorities saying we created the personal budget systems in part because of the push from the disabled persons community, meaning linked to the UN Convention, choice and control, etc., etc. And what they're seeing a few years down the line is that it does have a positive effect in many different ways. But that they underestimated the impact that it has on the existing social service providers, both in terms of the funding of the organizations, their ability to adapt to let's say, a different type of competition, maybe not, let's say, private type of competition, but human rights competition, but struggling to adapt to it. Workers also struggling to adapt to new forms of service provision, potentially putting in doubt let's say the continuity of certain forms of social services in the future, in particular for people with more severe or more important support needs. So, I mean, how can we support service providers more to adapt to this system, or do you think that there's no support needed for the existing organizations and workers?
Yeah, I think I'll probably be quite short on this, also because I'm curious to hear what Frank's last point was, so I want to give time to come back to him. Yeah, no, I understand. I think it's definitely a big challenge. I don't think we need to be too resistant to challenges. Sometimes having a challenge is a good thing, and I understand that it's something difficult for service providers, but I really think it's a positive step. But for sure, it's not something that can happen automatically, and training definitely needs to be given. I think at EDF, we're always calling for the EU funds and the member states to be used for this specific purpose in part, so that there will be support for and training for new ways of working for those working in more traditional forms of service provision to go towards this system more of personal assistance and real person-centered focus for how you do your work. So that's one way. Actually, well, that was really the main thing I was going to say. In terms of the continuity of service, I also wanted to kind of refer back to what was being mentioned earlier, I think by Frank right at the beginning, which was about the need to support also when we talk about personal budgets, the client, the service user, in actually being able to manage that, because it can be a real burdensome and time-consuming thing. And I won't list the examples we've seen throughout Europe. I have an example from Ireland, but Frank already mentioned this. So yeah, support for retraining professionals who are providing the services, and also support for the persons using the service to be able to manage that, especially if they require several assistants and 24-hour assistance, then it can really be quite tricky. So I think that would be the main thing I would say for now, and then I'll wait to see if there are any more questions from the comment box.
Thank you, Hayden, for that. A quick question to Karen again. We're not mentioning it maybe enough, and of course it's maybe not the role of organizations or people with disabilities to focus too much on this angle, but cost. Many people say it's too expensive. Karen, what would you say to people who argue that?
I think it always depends on the quantity of service users you look at. I think there are some studies, not too many, but they indicate that if we look at the large number of service users, of persons with disability, with all different kinds of support needs and different intensities of support needs, it's not more expensive than the so-called traditional services. If you only look at people with very high support needs and you look at the costs, their services in kind of group homes or whatever are, and you say, wow, now and look at that, if I provide 24/7 personal assistance for this person, now it's gonna be much more expensive or something like that. I think that's kind of the fear, and I think it's difficult for authorities to kind of look at the big picture and to kind of, the question you asked before, like it's not only difficult for service providers maybe to change 100%, it's also difficult for authorities to change their landscape of service provision 100%. And I think more courage would be needed for that. But I trust these studies that when they look at the big picture, I'm pretty confident that we would be able to provide this very person-centered type of service for probably the same amount of money. There would be extra costs in a transition period, that's clear. So that's my point of view.
Thank you, Karen. I think an important message there. I will now go through maybe the speakers. Frank could maybe bring in his last comments, but I would also like Frank, Hayden, and Irene to maybe, what role is there for the EU on this topic? Because the Organisation of Social Services is a national competence. So but is there a role for the EU, and if so, what is it? Maybe Frank, would you be able to start? And also you could, of course, bring in your final comment.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I will first do the final point, and then I will move on to the EU's role. I think the final point actually it links very well to the comment that Karen made about is it possible, will it take too much money? And I think and indeed I agree with Karen. But one point I wanted to add is what is also often said is if you give people budgets themselves, they will use it for the wrong reasons. There will be fraud, and we don't know where the money is going. And then I would also say, will there be in some instances fraud? And I will say probably yes, there will be fraud. Will it be high numbers of fraud? Then I say no, because in many countries where there has been research, it's like 1 or 2% or even less of people that where they see fraud and the checks are high. But then what we again see by the government is that there is a kind of an overreaction which makes it expensive. Like in the UK, there has been a whole lot of new checks and bureaucracy to prevent fraud, which basically meant that people who needed support now do not have access to it anymore, and therefore will go back to a system which will make them less independent and also then less able to contribute to society. So there again, I think that the fear of governments to make the change is the thing that needs to be addressed. And then what can be the EU's role? I think the EU's role can be really to show that the personal assistance is the way forward, and that all development should go in that direction. The way forward is to give people the budget to enable them to make choice, the budget and then the support, but really to have the budget control, and to also use projects in the European structural funds to really promote this, and to say like, okay, you need to invest in these pilots and then take them over with national funding. Another thing that the EU can do is provide guidelines on again on the working time, on the working conditions, to say if they make regulations or guidance in this field, to say also that personal assistance and the change of the support system to allow the inclusion of personal assistance in this should be taken into account from the worker's perspective point of view. The last thing I think is exchanging of good practices. Like we say, it already exists for people with all kinds of support needs, personal assistance in different countries. The problem is that many countries are not aware that it exists. So the EU can also share these practices and say in the semester reports, for instance, that if you make a new PA legislation, please look at this country who has done it in this way. Maybe this can be an inspiration for your country specifically. So
thank you, Frank. Hayden, would you like to add anything to Frank?
There you go. Yeah, as final words, I mean, having this system work is really a balance of mutual trust and respect. So, of course, the needs of the person with a disability, the service user, should be the focal thing. But the person using a service also has a responsibility to be a fair employer and to respect the integrity of the service provider. So there's this balance of what's your responsibility and what's also your right. I think that's very important to remember, and often we forget. And then the role of the EU. I mean, Frank said a lot of good things. So, but as I mentioned before, as well as funding for pilots, funding for training, we can adapt, and service providers can adapt. But I think the support needs to be there on an individual level and to help progression in your career, and just your change of practices and the change of your outlook on how you support persons with disabilities. And then, yeah, as Frank said, I think through the European semester process, a lot can be done to encourage member states to change the way they fund things and the way they do things. I think it would be particularly interesting to see a push for facilitating personal assistance in employment, for example. I think we only see a handful of countries where this is currently the case. But other than that, I think Frank has said already everything else I wanted to say.
Thank you, Hayden. Irene, now you have the probably most difficult task of following up on Frank and Hayden. Anything else that you think could be done at EU level?
Yeah, well, I would remind that the EU committed by signing the CRPD, so it has a strong, at least symbolic role into pushing forward those models who are really done in a way which is respecting the UN CRPD. Then, I mean, I support everything was said. For sure, I mean, data collection is key. The funding, for example, of ESF, which goes towards training, could go in general, I mean, because there are some elements of the personal budgets which can be in general positive for the services of tomorrow, and one is the person-centered support. So giving training, for example, at European level on that is also a way to help the sector develop. And then this could be a point of the follow-up of the disability strategy, something as the right to employment was something that was stressed as very important, and as personal budget might help in this could be also somewhere where the EU could have a role to play, I think.
Thank you, Irene, and also all the speakers today. So before passing the floor to Luke, maybe a few points I think for us on personal budgets is what we see is that the EU, although maybe it can't legislate particularly strongly on these issues, it definitely has a role to support national, regional policies in the funding of social services. Of course, with public procurement, clearly there's work to be done, and we discussed that earlier. But also the alternatives, reserved markets, personal budgets are really important issues and barely discussed at European level. And they really need to be part of EU initiatives, but also much stronger EU cooperation is needed, maybe the disability intergroup. I wish to thank everyone for bringing in their perspective. What I would like to keep just in mind, the last point is how can we respond? And I would ask Luc maybe a bit last minute to provide some ideas on this. But how can we make sure that the funding models we use, whatever we use, can help to make the life of Pia in Finland, but also of her daughter, much easier? I think that should be the focus of any funding model. Luc, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Voila, I have to unmute myself. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for this fantastic discussion. I must confess that at the start of the debate, I thought this will not work. This type of debate online will become a sort of a boring exercise. But what happened was the opposite of it. It was a very rich debate. And it will be very difficult for me to summarize it, so I will go back to the question of Tom, because that is, I think, the most important concern that we all should have in this debate. But nevertheless, a few elements maybe. It was very interesting to see how the debate slided away from funding into quality, into what do people actually want. And that is I think, very important. So the debate was moving away from looking at the money, looking at the funding systems, into how can we make sure that we provide the support that is supporting people to stay or to become again active participants in society. And that is what it is all about, I think. What do persons with a disability want? And Frank said it in his in a very clear way, and Hayden commented to that as well. It is about allowing full choice on to organize my life as I want to organize my life. Timely support, flexible support, tailor-made, with the individual at the steering wheel, with the family when it's about children, of course, then we should recognize the position of the family as well at the steering wheel. And for us as social service providers, that is challenging, because if I put next to that what social service providers want, well, social service providers want a facilitating ecosystem, an ecosystem in which we can operate, in which we can provide high quality services. And that requires coherent legal frameworks. If you change the legal frameworks over and over again, then it's very difficult to operate for social service providers. We need correct funding, so that indeed we can focus on what is really important. Correct funding is needed. And we need the skilled workforce. I fully support and I agree also with what was said by the representative of the trade unions. Although we are not a trade union organization, as providers, it is important to have a skilled workforce. We have to have an attractive sector. So to be able to do that, we need, we have to have this facilitating ecosystem to allow people to participate in society. And discussing the different elements, discussing public procurement, I think that again, it was made clear that that's maybe the social services sector is not a market like all the other markets. It was clearly stated by our colleague from the Netherlands. And the Commission, the representative of the Commission, stressed again that under the public procurement system, flexibility is possible. But then the problem is that it is not used by the authorities at local and regional level, and that there is no need for driving the working conditions down, but we see that it happens in practice. So from the Commission, we absolutely need more guidance so that authorities implement the public procurement legislation not only as an element to drive the costs down. Looking at reserved markets, it was very, very clearly stated again by different speakers that reserved markets may be better than other mechanisms, recognize the specificity of the not-for-profit element that we have in this sector. But also reserved markets do not guarantee a focus on quality. So also there we have to be innovative, I think, and competition is possible under a reserved market system if organized correctly. By the way, I'm not sure whether public procurement brings more competition. When we look at other markets in other areas of our life, we see that quite often public procurement is bringing less competition, and you see the market going into the hands of just a few players that then dictate their rules to the rest of society. So also there are a few elements we should look at. Of course, there is the personalized budgets, and I really believe that is the way forward. But there are a few issues there that we should look at as well, and we should I think also look at the downside that these models bring. But these models are new, so we should give them time to be explored and to be implemented in a correct way, and in a way so that we can, in a way, bypass the risks and the dangers that this model might bring. My conclusions, Tom, for individuals, I think that the debate is not over. We have to keep on discussing this because the funding system is not neutral. The funding system allows a certain approach or hinders a certain approach. And that is absolutely essential, I think. And in our sector, the focus should not be on reducing costs. The focus should be on, is this type of funding system facilitating the full participation of the individual in society? Is it facilitating the full enjoyment of human rights? Yes or no? And that is the funding system we want. And I think that also the Commission, through the different instruments that are available, European semester, public procurement, reviewing the mechanism, can help a lot. The discussion should also about how can we facilitate the further development of innovative models like the personal budget. And I think that we want also as a sector a clearer framework at EU level, recognizing the not-for-profit actors in this field, because we come on a sort of a battlefield where we don't want to be. We want to provide quality of services in co-production with service users. We don't want to go in a sort of a debate on how can we cut the cost to the absolute minimum. So further developing co-production methodologies and ways, I think, is the way forward. And we should keep the focus on what does a certain funding system mean for the quality of life of an individual, because this debate is not about statistics. This debate is about individual people that want to live a decent life, and they should be supported to be able to do that. Maybe a bit long conclusions, but these are mine, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Luc. I think that's it for the day. We will communicate the very good and long report, 120 pages, just about this topic across Europe, that was done by Kivilotre. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it well, but by Rebecca. We will share with everyone, and we will also do a report on this discussion. We will hopefully will also be able to make this video available to the public afterwards, as we've recorded it, but I will write an email to the speakers about this to see if it's okay for you. That's it. I'm glad we didn't really talk about coronavirus, at least for this morning. That was quite a success, I think. And now we can let you all go back to focus on your day-to-day jobs. Thanks for your time. Thanks to all the speakers, and thanks to the participants for joining us. Cheers. Bye.